The most powerful person you will ever encounter is not the most feared, not the most celebrated, and not the most visibly successful. It is the person who is so deeply invested in their own development that the world around them has no choice but to reorganize itself around what they are becoming. Most people distribute their attention according to the demands of their environment, responding to what arrives, managing what persists, and investing in whatever the immediate social landscape appears to require of them. This distribution feels natural because it corresponds to the most visible level of what a life contains, the relationships that need management, the expectations that need meeting, the continuous stream of external demands that present themselves with enough urgency to feel like the primary content of daily existence. What most people don't realize is that this distribution, however natural it feels, is the specific pattern that consistently produces a life shaped primarily by the expectations of others rather than by the genuine potential of the person living it. The person who redirects this attention, who takes the developmental investment that was being distributed across the demands of external management and concentrates it inward toward the sustained and disciplined development of their own capabilities, character, and clarity, does not simply become more capable. They become the primary author of the conditions their life produces, rather than the primary manager of the conditions their environment creates. Pay attention to what this distinction produces across sufficient time, because it produces a divergence so consequential that the two paths become essentially unrecognizable as starting from the same point. The person who distributed their attention externally becomes progressively more sophisticated at managing their environment. The person who concentrated their attention internally becomes progressively more capable of changing it. This is the self as the primary strategic investment, not as a self-absorption that excludes engagement with the world, but as the specific recognition that the quality of every engagement with the world is determined by the quality of the internal resources the engaging person brings to it. Most people miss this distinction because self-investment feels less immediately productive than environmental management. When someone calls, responding feels productive. When something breaks, fixing it feels productive. When an expectation arrives, meeting it feels productive. And all of these things are genuinely necessary. But none of them develop what the person bringing them is capable of. They simply deploy what already exists without expanding it. The obsession with self-mastery operates on a different principle entirely, one that most people encounter as an idea but rarely implement as a genuine practice, because its returns are invisible in the periods when the investment is being made and only fully visible in the periods when the alternative investment strategy has produced its own, considerably less impressive, results. This is where the distinction between outward and inward obsession reveals its most structurally significant dimension, because obsession is not a neutral force. It is a resource, the specific quality of sustained, intense, prioritized attention that every significant human achievement requires as its primary input, and the direction in which this resource flows determines, more completely than any other single variable, what it eventually builds. Most people's obsessive attention flows outward. It flows toward other people's opinions, monitoring, managing, and continuously adjusting to the signals that the social environment provides about how one is being perceived. It flows toward external validation, the specific confirmation that the people whose regard matters continue to provide it. It flows toward comparison, the continuous measurement of one's own position against the positions of others in the relevant social hierarchy. What most people don't realize is that every unit of obsessive attention directed outward in these ways is a unit of obsessive attention not directed toward the development of the internal capabilities that would eventually make the outward flowing concerns permanently irrelevant. The person who redirects their obsession inward, who makes their own development the primary object of their most sustained and most intense attention, discovers something that the outward, obsessed person rarely reaches, that the external validation they were monitoring so carefully begins arriving, uninvited and unrequested, as the natural byproduct of the internal development that had stopped requiring it. This connects directly to the identity as strategic architecture, which is perhaps the most consequential dimension of self-investment that most people's approach to personal development consistently fails to address with the deliberateness it deserves. Most people believe that identity is something that forms naturally through experience, that who they are emerges from what happens to them, from the relationships they inhabit, from the environments they move through, and the roles those environments assign them. Those who understand human nature know that this belief, while describing something real about how identity initially forms, consistently underestimates the degree to which identity, once consciously examined, can be deliberately reconstructed towards something more genuinely chosen. The identity that forms through environmental accumulation is shaped primarily by what the environment required, rather than by what the person genuinely contains. It reflects the adaptations demanded by the specific circumstances of a specific life, the specific social environments, the specific relational dynamics, the specific institutional structures that shaped behavior in specific ways at specific developmental moments. This identity is real. It is genuinely inhabited, but it is not necessarily the most accurate or most complete reflection of what the person actually contains. And it is almost certainly not the most strategically optimal foundation for the achievements the person is genuinely capable of. The deliberate construction of identity, the sustained, honest examination of what one actually values, what one is genuinely capable of, what one's most authentic objectives actually are, is therefore not a philosophical luxury. It is the specific strategic work that determines the ceiling of every performance the developing person will eventually produce. Few people understand that the identity they inhabit is largely inherited from circumstance, and that the deliberate choice to examine and reconstruct it is among the most consequential choices available to anyone serious about the quality of the life that identity will produce. Pay attention to what this examination requires, because it requires something that most people find genuinely difficult to sustain. The willingness to identify the aspects of one's inherited identity that are not genuinely chosen, not genuinely reflective of one's actual values and capabilities, and not genuinely serving the development of the person one is most authentically capable of becoming, and then the patient, disciplined, continuous work of replacing what was inherited with what is genuinely chosen. There is a force that operates in every person's life that is more consequential than any external circumstance, more determinative than any external opportunity, and more reliably predictive of the quality of outcomes a person will eventually produce than any assessment of their raw capability or their favorable conditions. It is the internal standard, not the standard a person declares publicly, the values they articulate in conversation, the principles they claim to hold, the version of their own character they present to the social audiences whose regard they value, but the standard that the actual pattern of their choices, across time and pressure and the private moments when no external accountability exists, consistently reveals as the operating criterion against which their behavior is genuinely measured. What most people don't realize is that this internal standard, however invisible it is in any individual moment, is the single most powerful determinant of the quality of life their choices will eventually produce, because it operates continuously in every decision, every response to difficulty, every moment when the easier path and the more demanding path diverge, as the specific filter through which the sum total of a person's daily behavior is determined. The person whose internal standard is genuinely high, not performed high, not aspirationally high, but actually high in the sense that their behavior consistently meets it, even when meeting it costs something, is engaged in a compounding process that most people never consciously initiate and therefore never experience the returns of. Every decision that met the standard built something. Every moment of discipline that the standard required developed something, and the development compounds, producing capabilities, character, and the specific quality of internal authority that only consistent self-governance can generate in ways that become progressively more visible across sufficient time. Pay attention to what the compound interest of daily discipline produces in practical terms, because it produces something that most people encounter in others without fully understanding its source. The person who has been applying consistent discipline to their own development for years looks from the outside like someone who possesses natural advantages that explain their capability, the ease with which they perform at a level that others find difficult, the composure they maintain under pressures that destabilize people of comparable intelligence, the specific quality of confidence that does not require external confirmation, because it was built from the accumulated evidence of their own consistent self-governance, rather than from the external assessments of people whose opinion they needed. Most people miss this warning sign because the compounding is invisible in its early stages, and because the people who are in the middle of it rarely announce the process. They are too occupied with the process itself to spend the attention that announcing it would require. The hidden reason the compound interest of daily discipline produces such decisive advantages across sufficient time is structural. Discipline applied consistently does not simply produce linear improvement in the specific capabilities it develops. It produces the meta-capability of being someone who applies discipline consistently. And this meta-capability transfers across every domain of endeavor the person subsequently enters, making them systematically more effective in every new context than people of equivalent natural capability who never develop the meta-capability that consistent discipline builds. This is where the relationship with discomfort reveals its function as the specific indicator that the most important developmental work is occurring. Most people experience discomfort as a signal that something is wrong, that the activity producing it should be stopped, modified, or replaced with something that produces less of it. This relationship with discomfort is understandable as a survival mechanism, but it is catastrophically counterproductive as a developmental orientation, because the activities that produce the most consequential development are almost always the ones that produce the most discomfort, and the person who stops at discomfort consistently stops precisely at the boundary where genuine development begins. The person who has become genuinely obsessed with their own development maintains a different relationship with discomfort, one built through the accumulated experience of having remained in productive discomfort long enough to observe what it produces on the other side. They have experienced enough times to have genuinely internalized the pattern that discomfort encountered in the service of genuine development is not the signal that the activity should stop. It is the signal that the activity is working. Few people understand that this specific reorientation of the relationship with discomfort is among the most consequential developmental changes available, because it unlocks access to the entire category of activities that produce the most significant development while being the most immediately uncomfortable to engage with. This connects directly to the elimination of the irrelevant, which is the discipline that protects the developmental process from the most reliably consistent mechanism of its interruption. Most people's lives contain a significant proportion of activities, relationships, and commitments that consume the finite resource of attention without contributing to the development of the specific capabilities and character that their most genuine objectives require. These are not always obviously wasteful. They are often present with enough apparent social validity, enough relationship maintenance function, or enough immediate gratification to feel like necessary components of a balanced life. But the person who has genuinely become their own greatest obsession develops through the clarity that sustained self-investment eventually produces. the ability to distinguish between what is genuinely essential and what is immediately comfortable, and the discipline to organize their life around the former rather than the latter, regardless of the specific social discomfort that this organization occasionally creates. Pay attention to what this elimination produces in practical terms, because it produces something that most people experience as a paradox until they understand its source. The person who has eliminated the irrelevant has more time, more energy, and more attention than the person who has not because they have fewer demands on these resources, but because they have stopped directing them toward things whose consumption produces no return that their most genuine objectives require. This is where the self-contained source of motivation reveals its function as the specific quality that makes sustained self-obsession possible across the periods of difficulty, apparent stagnation, and reduced external validation that every significant developmental process inevitably contains. Most people's motivation is primarily externally sourced, driven by the approval they are receiving, the validation that is arriving, the visible progress that confirms their effort is producing results. This source of motivation is real in its effects, but it is also contingent in its availability, dependent on external circumstances cooperating with the specific conditions that maintain it. The person who has genuinely become their own greatest obsession operates from a different motivational source, one that the external environment cannot remove because it was never built from external conditions. It is built from the internal standard, from the genuine interest in their own development that sustained self-investment eventually produces, from the specific satisfaction of a person who measures progress not against external benchmarks, but against the distance between who they currently are and who their most genuine assessment of their own potential suggests they are capable of becoming. Most people miss this principle because they are looking for motivation in the places where it is most immediately available, in external recognition, in comparative achievement, in the social confirmation that their effort is being noticed and valued. The hidden reason these sources consistently fail to sustain motivation through the most demanding developmental periods is that they are controlled by the environment rather than by the developing person. And motivation controlled by the environment will always be withdrawn by the environment at precisely the moments when the developing person most needs it to sustain the work that the environment is not yet confirming is producing results. This is where the transformation as structural inevitability completes the entire framework, because it identifies the specific relationship between internal development and external results that makes the transformation described throughout this video not an aspiration but a predictable consequence. Most people pursue transformation as an external objective, a changed set of circumstances, relationships, or outcomes that they are working toward, and that will represent the arrival of the transformation they have been seeking. Those who understand human nature know that this sequencing, pursuing the external transformation as the primary objective while treating internal development as the means to that end, consistently produces the less durable version of the transformation it achieves. The transformation that arrives through genuine internal development is structurally different from the transformation that arrives through the fortunate alignment of external circumstances, because it was built from the inside out, from the changed internal architecture that changed external results are the natural consequence of rather than the lucky precondition for. The person who has genuinely become their own greatest obsession, who has invested in their own development with the sustained, disciplined, genuinely compounding attention that self-obsession describes, does not arrive at transformation as the endpoint of a journey. They arrive at it as the structural inevitability of a process that was always going to produce it, because changed internal architecture consistently produces changed external reality, not as a hope, as a mechanism. Few people understand that this development is never completed, that the person who has genuinely made themselves their greatest obsession is not working toward a finished state, but is engaged in a continuous process whose returns compound indefinitely and whose ceiling consistently exceeds whatever the previous period's development suggested was the limit. True influence begins when the person you are becoming is more compelling than any external circumstance you are managing. Power rarely announces itself, and the power of someone who has genuinely invested in their own development announces itself last of all in the specific quality of what they produce, how they respond to difficulty, and how the world around them consistently and quietly reorganizes itself around what they have built. The transformation was never the destination. It was always the structural consequence of the obsession. Begin the obsession